Welcome back to The Explainer. Today, we are diving into a topic that is quite literally reshaping global geopolitics as we speak. If you're building an analytical framework for your UPSC exams, or honestly, if you're just trying to understand the future of global power, this is absolutely essential. We are talking about critical minerals, the ultimate geopolitical currency of the 21st century. Make no mistake, the nation that controls these minerals controls the future of technology, energy, and defense.
Here is our roadmap for today's high-yield notes. First, the new strategic foundation, followed by the geopolitics of supply and India's potential and vulnerabilities. Then, we'll cover structural constraints, India's policy response, and wrap things up with a critical analysis of the way forward.
Okay, let's dive right into this. Section 1. The new strategic foundation. Looking at recent analysis from The Hindu, we can see exactly how the narrative is shifting in real time. Critical minerals have moved way beyond the margins of basic resource policy. They are now at the absolute center of industrial strategy and national security. We aren't just talking about mining anymore, guys. We are talking about national survival in an advanced, industrialized world.
Just to make sure we're all on exactly the same page, let's define our terms. When we say critical minerals, we're talking about foundational elements: lithium, cobalt, nickel, graphite, copper, and rare earths. These aren't just commodities. They are the non-negotiable building blocks for electric vehicles, renewable energy systems, semiconductors, and advanced manufacturing. Without these, the entire green energy transition simply doesn't happen.
I really want you to absorb this quote from the source. As decarbonization and digitalization accelerate, mineral security is becoming as important as oil once was. Think about that for a second. All the geopolitical power dynamics, the conflicts, the massive wealth generation that completely defined the 20th century oil era, all of that intensity is now shifting directly to these specific minerals.
Which brings us to our next point, Section 2, Geopolitics of Mineral Supply.
Now, what's really interesting about this data is, if these minerals are the new oil, we urgently need to look at who controls the tap. And the standout metric here is 86%. For key minerals like copper, lithium, nickel, cobalt, and rare earths, the average market share of just the top 3 refining countries hit a massive 86% in 2024. Just a few years ago, in 2020, it was 82%. So despite all the global talk about diversifying supply chains, refining power is actually getting more concentrated.
And when we break down who makes up that concentration, the sheer scale of China's dominance is, well, it's stark. China is the leading refiner in 19 out of 20 strategic minerals. We're looking at processing monopolies of over 90% for rare earths and graphite, nearly 75% for cobalt, and 70% of lithium chemicals. This makes the mineral market incredibly geopolitical, not merely commercial.
Naturally, this level of concentration leads to some massive impending geopolitical risks. The source outlines a projected 30% shortfall in copper supply by 2035, and a lithium market deficit is expected by the 2030s due to skyrocketing demand. Compounding all of this, China's rare earth export controls, announced in 2025, are raising deep concerns across major global industries. In response to this, economies are scrambling. The European Union is setting strict benchmarks, like having 10% domestic extraction and no more than 65% reliance on a single country, while the U.S. is rapidly diversifying through new international partnerships.
Let's pivot to our domestic realities. Section 3, India's potential and vulnerabilities.
So where exactly does India sit in this global chess match? We have massive clean energy and manufacturing ambitions, right? Well, to hit that net zero target by 2070, India's cumulative demand for energy transition minerals could reach a staggering 169 million tons. That is 51% higher than what is projected under the current policy pathway. The sheer scale of what India is going to need is breathtaking.
But listen, India isn't starting from zero here. You'll definitely want to note these figures for your exams. India actually has significant domestic reserves. We're looking at 211.6 million tons of graphite, 189 million tons of nickel, 163.9 million tons of copper, and 44.9 million tons of cobalt, alongside crucial monazite deposits that contain precious rare earth oxides. The raw potential is absolutely there in the ground.
However, having reserves does not automatically equal having security. Let's contrast the approaches. The European Union, the US, and Australia are aggressively building out integrated supply chains through strict mandates and heavy processing investments. India, on the other hand, is still developing its foundational capability. Right now, we remain heavily import-dependent for high-purity inputs of lithium, cobalt, and nickel.
which leaves us highly vulnerable to global supply disruptions.
So the crucial point is, what is holding us back? Section 4, Structural Constraints and Bottlenecks.
What exactly is keeping India dependent despite having these resources? Well, translating raw mineral potential into actual capability is incredibly difficult due to several systemic domestic roadblocks. Exploration in India remains relatively shallow and slow. Furthermore, getting regulatory clearances can be a very time-consuming process. Because of those delays and the challenging economics of mining in remote regions, private capital participation remains severely limited. The risk is just too high for them right now.
But you know, mining is really only half the battle. The ultimate vulnerability, the real bottleneck, is processing. Even when minerals are pulled out of the ground domestically, our capacity for high-purity production is heavily constrained. India lacks large-scale facilities, like smelting or purification plants for copper and graphite. This midstream gap is exactly where India loses massive value and exposes itself to those geopolitical risks we discussed earlier.
Okay, let's look at how the government is tackling this. Section 5. India's policy response.
The government has clearly recognized this gap, and we are seeing a major strategic pivot. The real shift began in 2023 when 30 critical minerals were officially identified. Looking ahead, a massive diplomatic lever is the India-US Critical Minerals and Rare Earths Framework signed in May 2026. Furthermore, the 2026-27 budget actively proposes establishing dedicated rare earth corridors across Odisha, Kerala, Andhra Pradesh, and Tamil Nadu. So the diplomatic and budgetary momentum is definitely building.
To support the entire value chain, they launched the National Critical Mineral Mission. The targets here are highly specific, perfect for your notes. We're looking at 1,200 domestic exploration projects by 2030-31, the domestic production of at least 15 critical minerals, and the acquisition of 50 overseas mining assets by Indian companies. And we are already seeing action on this front. For instance, Kabil has successfully secured over 15,000 hectares in Argentina's Catamarca province, specifically for lithium exploration.
And this brilliantly illustrates our final point. Section 6. Critical Analysis and the Way Forward.
Because having policies and securing land is a great start, but how does India convert that into actual industrial capability? The source emphasizes that individual policy measures, while necessary, are insufficient on their own. The next phase must be pure, sustained execution. First, India desperately needs to operationalize strategic stockpiles to weather sudden supply shocks. Second, we must establish clear, mineral-specific risk thresholds and measurable milestones. Third, recycling has to be integrated into supply planning. The data actually shows recycling could eventually meet up to 25% of our copper and graphite demand by mid-century. Finally, this all requires a highly coordinated institutional framework where the government shares risk to attract private capital. Processing and refining must become a unified national industrial priority backed by serious applied R&D.
Which brings us to the ultimate question we have to ask as we watch this play out on the global stage. Will India successfully execute its mineral security strategy to define its own industrial trajectory? Or will deep-rooted structural constraints keep it dependent in this new energy era? That is the geopolitical tightrope India is walking right now. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer. Keep those UPSC notes organized, stay curious, and I'll catch you in the next one.